Welcome into the studio, guys. Today we're going to use the equipment we have and the space we have here to talk all about training the shoulders, specifically the muscles of the deltoid, the rotator cuff, and the upper trapezius. So really breaking down shoulder training if you have pain, dysfunction, if you want to build muscle, if you want to build strength, if you're an athlete, just getting the most we possibly can out of the shoulder training that we do. Now, before we get into sets, reps, my favorite exercises, tips, tricks, etc., let's go over like the most foundational, basic anatomy of the shoulder. So let's start with three bones to talk about. The first is the humerus, okay, the upper arm bone. It has a ball and socket joint on the end of it, just like your femur, that goes in here, and it gives that shoulder amazing range of motion, okay? Just like the hip can go all around like this because it's a ball and socket, the shoulder can too with even more freedom because it's less restricted, but the ball and socket on the end of the humerus. That attaches to this bone right here that many of you call your collarbone. We call it the clavicle, okay? Those two go together to make kind of a golf ball on a tee looking thing that allows for all this to happen, okay? You have multiple joints on this particular bone that I don't think are all that important. Just know they kind of attach right here, sternum area. We call that the SC joint, the sternoclavicular joint, and then we have over here the AC joint, the acromioclavicular joint, where the shoulder kind of runs into that ball and socket. The last bone to know is this bone on the back of the body, the shoulder blade, as it's often called, the scapula. So clavicle, collarbone, scapula, shoulder blade, humerus, arm bone. All right? Those are the big bones, the big players, and the big muscle that goes right over the top of the cap of the shoulder, kind of like a flap of meat, is the deltoid. And that's what's responsible for raising the shoulder in all these different planes and plays a big role in pressing overhead. We also have on the scapula itself muscles in the rotator cuff. We'll talk about what they do, how you can make yours stronger, and we'll also discuss the trapezius, the muscles of the traps, as they're often called, the neck, and what those do for good, high-quality shoulder training. When it comes to training the shoulder, I actually like to start with mobility because it's so important to this joint specifically. To get your shoulder to do all of the movements I'd like it to do in the gym, if you were a client, I'd actually start with assessing your mobility. Now, there's two main functions of shoulder mobility I really want to pay attention to for new lifters, and we'll add a third one just for fun. The first is shoulder flexion. Can you get your arm to extend up so that your bicep blocks your ear? If you can do that, you have pretty good shoulder flexion. Now, let's also test, can we rotate around all the way down to the side? That's going to test the articulation of the glenohumeral joint, which is a fancy way of saying, do we have enough mobility to get up? And then do we have enough mobility in the capsule of the joint itself to rotate over and come around? We can also test a third function, extension, by moving back. We don't have as much extension as we do flexion, but we want to be able to move back and come around. Those functions are important: flexion, articulation or rotation, and extension. But also, we need to have good external rotation, okay? That looks like stuff like this and stuff like this. And for most people, they have limited flexion. They can't get much past this position. Very few people can actually flex the shoulder enough to cover the ear. If I can have a client raise their arm up and I can still see their ear, their bicep can't block it, I'm going to work on mobility here. And that's oftentimes through stretching the lats, the chest, and working into positions like this that actually let me get into a position where my biceps are blocking my ears, so you can regain some of the flexion. Same thing if you have poor external rotation or poor shoulder extension. You can't row your chest up, right? It might make sense to stretch into the lats a little bit, okay? To do things like stretch into the chest a little bit, those muscles that can kind of get tight and promote internal rotation. And then of course creating strength. So mobility in the shoulder is really big. And I use this tool, so to speak, this movement, so to speak, to really assess dynamically. A shoulder press tells a lot. If people press out in front like this, you see this all the time. You say, hey, press overhead. And they press up, and they press up, and they can't keep pressing up without extending the hips and turning it into almost an incline bench press because they just do not have the mobility to stay in the shoulder slot they started in. So if a client can't press overhead, or a client presses way out in front of their face, I don't use the overhead press as a key movement, despite the fact that it is undeniably the best exercise, in my opinion, for training the whole shoulder. This is such a good movement, right? We love the overhead press. It hits the front delt, the medial delt, hits the triceps, great shoulder movement, probably the #1 bang for your buck. But if you're leaning back and pressing forward and like doing a standing incline bench, it is probably worth working on the mobility you have to flex the shoulder, getting a little more out of it so that you can actually press over your fucking head. Because if not, you might do more harm than good, and it might be worth it to do some of the other exercises like raises and other things that we'll talk about. If you can overhead press with good form, definitely include overhead pressing in your shoulder program. If you can, or if you can't, I want you doing this exercise as well. This is the second exercise of my kind of series of awesome exercises for shoulder mobility and function. This one's called the face pull, and it really promotes external rotation. So this is gonna strengthen the rear deltoid. It's gonna strengthen the muscles of the rotator cuff that promote external rotation. Now remember, there's 4 muscles in there, and not all of them do external rotation, but the ones that do are coming to the party with the rear deltoids as well as the trapezius. And so that is one for the back of the shoulders, for the muscles of the scapula, and for kind of up and into the neck area that I absolutely love. We do this with pretty much every client that we have. Now, if that is advanced, or you don't have a ton of equipment, you can simulate some of those same movement patterns, okay, with a band very easily. You can do a face pull from pretty much any door frame with a band. Again, that face pull incorporates elements of external rotation, right? So you can actually work on external rotation. But that's a critical movement, in my opinion, for training the shoulders. Let me show you another awesome movement for developing the front and anterior portions of the deltoid. This is one I have come to absolutely love over the years, and it is a play on the popular exercise, the lateral raise, which is great for the shoulders, but I really like doing this with my chest fully supported. And instead of going straight out to the sides, I like to come up in the shape of a Y. And what I get from leaning on this pad is more stability and, frankly, less ability to cheat with momentum. So I feel my deltoids working much harder, much earlier in the set, because it's a much stricter exercise when I'm doing it in that position. And when you're extending the shoulders out and away from the body, or the hands out and away from the body in this plane, you're working the medial deltoid and a little bit of the front deltoid. So just between that raise and that face pull, I'm working my whole shoulder. And if I can't overhead press, those two would be my exercise 1 and 2 for developing strong shoulders that can hold a lot, do a lot, transmit and absorb a lot of force. If I could shoulder press would be 1, and that would be 2 and 3. And those would be kind of my big 3. And you can build off of this, right? You can do a Y raise, you can do a lateral raise, you can do a raise for the rear delts to complement your face pull. You can also do all of those on a cable. Now, to hit the upper trapezius, an important muscle that plays a big role in elevating the shoulders, you'll often see clients do exercises like shrugs, where they hold a barbell and shrug up. And that will train the trapezius. My favorite way to train it, as somebody who's more advanced, is using Olympic lifts and doing things like cleans or hang cleans, where I'm pulling the bar up into space, and that actually is going to cause my shoulders to elevate. Now, not everybody can do a hang clean, and not everybody can do heavy shrugs. So you have other options like dumbbell shrugs, where you can shrug up and down under control. And you can simulate those cleans I just showed you with things like dumbbell upright rows, where you kind of act almost as though you're zipping up a hoodie and doing some shoulder elevation, scapula elevation, one side at a time, or with 2 dumbbells, you could do this. That would work your traps a lot, and it doesn't require that you have the skill that a Olympic lift does. However, if you look at the backs and the traps of people who do these lifts, they tend to be very well developed. And additionally, to compete in Olympic weightlifting, the amount of stress and strain that is placed on the shoulder is pretty extreme. So the fact that these guys can do all these cleans shows a lot about, in my opinion, the safety of those movements. Not that that's the best choice for most people. Another really popular thing to focus on, an important thing to focus on when training the shoulder, is stability. You see exercises like the bottom-up press promoted a lot as being great for promoting shoulder stability because it's an awkward movement and the dumbbell's kind of moving around. And it does promote some shoulder stability. True. There's also a lot of wrist stability baked into that movement. But one of the things I really like to do to promote better shoulder stability for clients are exercises like plank shoulder taps, where the client has to stabilize on one shoulder at a time with elbow extension and a little wrist bend. That to me shows up a lot in lifts. We want good shoulder stability on our presses specifically, so I like things like plank shoulder taps a little more than I like things like those bottoms up presses. I do still like the presses. Now, for stretching, for mobility, again, the shoulder's not just about the muscles that move the shoulder or that sit atop the shoulder. It's the muscles that bypass and intersect through the shoulder, which there are many. It's important to stretch the pecs. These muscles have a tendency to get tight. Stretch the lats. We talked about this already. Stretch across the rear deltoid into the rhomboids, okay? Stretch the T-spine, the thoracic spine, the middle of the back. Having good thoracic spine mobility almost always leads to better shoulder mobility. The T-spine is very important, and the better it moves, the better the shoulder moves. You can also do very basic standing shoulder stretches, like cross body or overhead stretches for the shoulder, lat, and tricep. Very little bit goes a very long way. My favorite things to do, again, are these articulations, where I just actually work on moving my joint through its full range of motion, trying to get more complete circles. And so, folks, there you have it. That's kind of how I look at how the shoulder moves, what it does, and how I start training it. For novices, athletes, and people with any goals, no matter what it is, I want you to have good flexion, rotation, and extension. I want you to be able to load overhead in this plane and against resistance in this plane. You should have enough mobility, in my opinion, to make a full circle, as well as enough mobility to get a good stretch at the bottom of a shoulder press and come together over the head. You got all those things, your shoulder's probably working great, and you can progress it over time. One way or another, it's an easy joint to work with, and even if you have something like a labrum issue, a rotator cuff issue, or an impingement, I wouldn't give up. I keep working through it, and remember that the body is resilient and adaptive. If you like the video, hit thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and comment what muscle group or area of the body you'd like to see next.